Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today, Carbon Insetting. As usual, we'll keep it short to just 30 minutes. It's another webinar in our series, Straight from the Horse's Mouth, Insights from Experts in 30 minutes. My name's Barbara and I am your host for the next half hour. Today we have two guests. We have Mark Harris from Meridian Energy and Sean Weaver from Ekos, a frequent speaker in our webinar series. And we will focus on carbon insetting, the often forgotten or neglected stop on the carbon journey. With a very brief introduction, the topic today follows up from a last webinar that we did on the carbon journey. So we talked last time about reduce, measure, verify, offset as a key stop on the carbon journey. And as I said, often neglected is the stop of insetting, because it's an alternative exit. If you like, you can, after you verify and you wish to be zero carbon, you can either go off to the offset side, or you can also go off to the inset side. And Sean will explain a little bit more about what insetting actually is, and Mark will share a practical example on how Meridian are going about it. So without further ado, I will hand over to Mark and Sean.
Thank you, everyone. So yeah, carbon insetting. So we'll just go ahead with kind of rewinding to the carbon management story of measure, reduce, verify and offset. I like to highlight this as a bit of an exercise of harvesting fruit on a tree. We measure our carbon emissions, and that helps us identify where we can make reductions. Of course, we would be best to target those reductions in those areas of our footprint that are carbon intensive, and that would be a relatively low cost per unit of reduction to reduce. And in this example, transportation and flights are a big part of that business's footprint. And so reducing them can happen at a low or reasonable cost. And we're harvesting the low hanging fruit on the emission reductions tree. But of course, we still have residual emissions in our carbon footprint, and this is why we look towards offsetting. With the reductions, we are harvesting those fruit on our own tree. When it comes to offsetting, we're causing carbon benefits to happen essentially on somebody else's tree by causing carbon gains to happen outside of our business boundary. And as a result, we can then have a net zero position and have a certification for zero carbon. Insetting is defined by the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance. It defines insetting as a carbon reduction project verified by an offset standard which occurs within a company's supply chain or supply chain community. So I just want to focus on this verified by an offset standard. So insetting is really the same as offsetting in as much as you are still producing carbon credits. They are certified and they are issued in a registry, and they follow all of those quality control rules of carbon offsetting. The key difference is that you're creating this supply chain of credits yourself rather than buying them on the market from someone else. So in this example, the types of carbon credits that you might use for carbon insetting could include New Zealand units, they could include verified emission reduction units, or they could include verified carbon units. New Zealand units are units sourced from the compliance carbon market, so the regulated markets, whereas the verified emission reduction units, say, certified to the gold standard or to the standard, and verified carbon units from the verified carbon standard. These are sourced from the international voluntary carbon market supply chain. But like New Zealand units, they are issued in a registry and they have very similar controls. And among those controls is that when carbon units that are used for insetting are consumed in essentially an offsetting exercise, they must be cancelled in a carbon registry to avoid double counting. So the procedures are very much the same as carbon offsets. The difference being, though, that instead of causing those high-hanging fruit to be harvested on someone else's tree outside your business boundary, you're essentially changing your business boundary to include these activities. And these activities can include, for example, a forest carbon project that happens somewhere in your country or even another country. But let's have a look at a comparison between offsetting and insetting for a moment. In offsetting, we buy carbon credits on the market. And as a result, we are exposed to future carbon prices because the price at the moment might be reasonably tolerable, but in future, we don't know what that's going to do. And especially if we're in it for the long game, if we think about what are the prices going to be up towards 2030 and beyond, then this is something to seriously consider. Because if we're going to commit to zero carbon now, we're also committing to reductions through that time and acquiring carbon credits to net out any residual emissions. As a result, we'll also be exposed to carbon credit supply competition and risk. Lots more entities are going to be seeking carbon credits in the market. You'll also have less ability to control the provenance of your carbon credits. In other words, what kind of project do they come from? Because when there's lots and lots of demand, it's more difficult to get a source of credits of a particular provenance that suits you. Lower costs in the short term for offsetting, but can potentially be quite a lot higher costs in the long term, depending on what happens to carbon prices. Now, this is a contrast to insetting, where you grow your own carbon credits, and therefore you can acquire your credits at cost, and essentially the cost of production, rather than what the market price requires you to pay. You also get security of supply of your credits because you own that supply chain or you co-own it. You also get to control the provenance of your carbon credits. It is a higher cost in the near term because you've got to build that carbon credit project, but it can be significantly lower costs in the long term. Also, you own an asset which can occupy a different place on your company books. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail at a couple of these things. Now, one option is to develop a carbon project in a forest carbon situation. Forest carbon is not the only way that you can generate carbon credits, but I'm going to focus on the forest story because this is what we focus on at Ekos. And in a New Zealand setting, most carbon credits are in the forest space, certainly domestically. You could do a forest carbon project on your own land if you have land on which to do it. Or if you don't currently own land, you could buy land. Then you have another asset. You could lease land or you could joint venture with a landowner. As I've said, you're acquiring your carbon credits at cost and getting security of supply of credits. Now, we'd all have to think, what are carbon prices likely to do in the medium to long term? Now, heading towards the Paris Agreement obligation period in 2030 and in the first few years beyond that, the likelihood is that globally competition for carbon credits is going to go up, and the ability for any economy to have lots of spare carbon credits may indeed go down, and this is going to drive prices up. Increasing demand towards the 2030 Paris Agreement obligation period is also likely going to influence market prices, and there may also be a diminishing supply internationally as all other countries have nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement as part of their commitment to Paris, in which case there may not be lots and lots of spare carbon credits coming out of countries like India and China. You get to control the provenance of your carbon credits. What I mean by this is, well, what kind of project is it going to come from? Is it going to be a plantation forest? Is it going to be a native forest? What kind of sustainable land management is involved? Are there co-benefits in the form of biodiversity, climate resilience, these sorts of things? The provenance also has a geography because many people like to source credits from their own communities, and that's certainly true for many New Zealand buyers would prefer to source carbon credits from New Zealand, and I'm sure the same is true for Australian buyers. And if you grow your own carbon credits, you can control not only what country your credits come from, but even what region your carbon credits come from. And that can have a really good synergy with your clients and your stakeholders, but also your staff and their involvement in this. You can also emphasize the co-benefits that your project then delivers in terms of biodiversity, sustainability, and things like climate resilience. We need in New Zealand to reforest many of our landscapes to get more ready for extreme weather events, especially cyclones. And so these carbon projects can contribute to climate change resilience and adaptation. If they're going to have a durable role to play as carbon inset projects, they really do need to be permanent projects. And so they would typically need to involve some form of conservation covenant. Certainly the projects that we are involved in all have conservation covenants to create that permanence. Higher costs in the short term, potentially lower costs in the long term. Let's have a look at what the cash flows can look like here. And this is a discounted free cash flow for a typical carbon insetting project where you've got a lot of cost at the beginning, where you're building your carbon credit factory. In other words, you're establishing your forest and registering it as a carbon project. And this is all the costs involved in buying seedlings, land preparation, planting the trees, stopping animals from eating your capital expenditure, and fencing and all of that sort of stuff. But then thereafter, after that first 4 years or so, you're into really operational expenditures where the costs are far less than the establishment costs. And what this does is create expensive short-term but low-cost long-term. Looking at different forest types in a New Zealand setting here, what I've got here is a graph which shows a business, medium-sized corporate or small, depending on what their main business is about, 30,000 tonnes of demand annually starting, but with a demand curve which is in yellow and then trailing down. This is just a placeholder demand curve because, of course, with ambitious emission reduction strategies, we'll be having that yellow line heading down much more steeply. But certainly as a placeholder, I've put it there declining slowly. We need to design the forest in terms of the size of forest to fit your demand curve. Now, the 30,000 tonnes of demand will require different sizes of project depending on what forest type you are growing. So you see down the bottom, you've got the orange curve, which is 1,500 hectares of indigenous forest in New Zealand. And you'll see that it doesn't even meet the demand curve anywhere in its trajectory. Then the next line up, the grey one, is a Pinus radiata forest, assuming that it's not going to be harvested. And you can see that that does intersect with the demand curve and rises above and then hovers just above. Then the next line up is a mixed species forest where it's got exotic hardwoods such as eucalypts or oaks mixed with natives, where most of the carbon heavy lifting is being done by the hardwoods, which sequester carbon much more quickly than natives. That's the green line. And then the blue line at the top is where it's just exotic hardwoods like eucalypts or oaks or ash or something like that. What this tells us is that it's important to think about what kind of forest we are going to need to plant in order to meet our demand. And this also has a significant impact on cost. The area differences between the different forest types are there. About 1,400 hectares if you want to get 30,000 tonnes of demand at the beginning. If it's going to be natives, you're actually going to have a much bigger forest. You'll need to have 3,500 hectares. If it's a mixture of exotic hardwoods and natives, it's just under 1,500 hectares, and then 1,500 hectares if it's a pine forest. So you can imagine that this area would also have quite a big impact on what it's going to cost. And so the capital expenditure required for meeting 30,000 tonnes annual demand for the different forest types is actually quite dramatic. So in the millions, the native forest is going to require 30, 32, 33 million in capex compared to mixed natives and hardwoods, which are about 9 million. Pine forest even less, and exotic hardwoods are similar to pines. One of the most important measures in all of this is what is the effective carbon price that you're going to have to pay, say, across a 30-year cash flow for your carbon credits if you were to build your own project. And this is a really important measure to help a business understand what sort of forest it ought to grow. Now, this is the effective carbon price of the different forest types, with hardwoods on the left in blue, approximately $25 a tonne. Indigenous carbon credits, approximately $100 a tonne it's going to cost you, and about $25 a tonne for mixed hardwoods or pine trees. And this is a really important factor to think about, because remember, to do insetting, part of the reason is to have a reduced exposure to carbon prices. The project cycle for developing a carbon insetting project for corporate clients, you need to do a pre-feasibility assessment to tell you what size forest, to give you options to consider, and then start building an initial business case. Then if you decide to go ahead or go to the next stage, you need to recruit land. It depends. If you've got your own land, it's not going to be that expensive to recruit. But if you're going to have to jump into joint ventures with people, and if you're going to try and find a couple of thousand hectares of land, that can be quite a big undertaking. So you need to spend some money on that. Approximate costs around 50K for that. You need to do some design work and feasibility assessments, and then eventually a full business plan, which gets the project to be investment ready and implementation ready. And then actual implementation, the cost of that will depend on the business plan and the size of the forest. In terms of timing, pre-feasibility assessments, you need to allow about a month. Site recruitment can happen in parallel with project design, 4 to 6 months. A business plan, about 6 months. But then implementation, the first thing that you do is order seedlings, and you have to order your seedlings at least 1 year in advance of the first planting. So I'm going to hand over now to Mark Harris from Meridian, who's doing what I've just described. So Mark, over to you to talk about the Meridian Forever Forest program.
Just one quick question, sorry Mike, because we do have a question and I thought we might just answer that right away. Phil is asking, I've heard the term carbon insetting also being used elsewhere rather than buying carbon offsets or credits, that an organization could divert equivalent funds to invest in internal emission reduction projects such as EVs, e-bikes, electrifying heat production. Do you have a comment on potential confusion of the different use of the same term?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that is true. Carbon insetting can be done inside a business, but I mean, I think we do need to do some definition management here, because when you're doing something inside your business, you're essentially harvesting higher fruit on your tree inside the business. So for me, I don't really see much difference in that than just emission reductions. It's when we're trying to do something to harvest those very high fruit that we can't afford to do inside our business. That's what I call offsetting or insetting. Whereas the other activity I would call emission reductions. But I think the international community really does need to look at how to appropriately define these things so we can differentiate between those two things. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Sean. Kia ora koutou, ka mahai ma. Greetings, everyone. I can see 1 or 2 familiar names in the participant list, so welcome, everyone. I'm going to talk briefly just about Meridian, about our overall forest program, and then talk to an example of a planting project down at Manapuri, which is underway. I mean, most people will know, I'm sure you do, but Meridian is one of the big generators in New Zealand. We're 51% owned by government. We are New Zealand's largest generator by gigawatt hour by energy, and have about 30-35% market share on any given day. Our largest customer is the TY smelter, which is important for us, but also important for New Zealand in terms of the future. I've been with Meridian for 17 years in various roles, but I'm currently the Renewable Development Program Manager. I've got responsibility for hydro optimization, wind farm consents, potential solar consents, emerging technology, and forest, which is a total privilege, and certainly fantastic to be working with Sean and Ekos. I'll just run over the numbers quickly for Meridian before talking to the more wider and more better points. Meridian's emissions annually are around 37,000 tonnes a year, scope 1, 2 and 3. That's small compared to other generators and people who use thermal fuel and so on. But we made a decision to inset those emissions, and these are from normal New Zealand business operations, which is quite an important point. So we've made a decision to inset those and basically grow our own credits in New Zealand rather than purchase credits in the international market to cover those. So last year, for example, we purchased credits from a wind farm in India. There's nothing wrong with that, but we've made this other decision for reasons which I'll get onto. To cover our 37,000 tonnes per annum, we need to plant a minimum of 1,500 hectares. So to give that a quantum, that's about 3,000 rugby pitches or thereabouts. And that will equate to, depending on the planting density, but at least a minimum of 1.5 million trees, and probably a lot more. So 1.5 to 2 million trees. That's the scale of the program. Why are we doing this? Well, we've got a policy and economic context for New Zealand, which is very important for everyone, but important for Meridian. So decarbonising the economy and a government policy or aspiration around 100% renewable generation by 2035. Very important contextual elements to this. We have a large sustainability program in our own right in terms of mitigating our own emissions as much as we can and scrubbing carbon out of our systems and processes. And we have three main objectives with the forestry program. The first, as I referred to, is growing our own credits in New Zealand. And Sean's already touched on this. What we've realised and modelled is that we think it will be economic and commercial in the future to grow our own credits in this country rather than buy them on the international market. So there's a commercial or business outcome to this. I should point out at this point too that we'll never cover all our emissions. We'll always be looking to buy credits on markets or from markets to cover the variable nature of electricity and energy provision in New Zealand. The picture there is Lake Benmore down in the Waitaki, beautiful place, as is Pukaki a bit further north. But our lakes are small, so we have small storage and highly volatile or variable inflows from year to year. So what that means is companies like Meridian need to work with and contract with thermal generators in the North Island to ensure security of supply. So it's quite an important point. We'll always have credits that we need to buy to cover carbon costs associated with thermal generation in the electricity market. Well, the second objective for us is a long-term native biodiversity outcome. Very important for Meridian given its ethos, and we were looking for ways that we could generate credits and end up with an outcome along those lines. And the third objective for us is long-term community and stakeholder engagement, and which leads to all sorts of things in terms of employment and so on. So those are our three main goals. We went to an RFI about 18 months ago, and Ekos proposed the mixed forestry model, which seemed to fit our needs in terms of the commercial outcome, the native biodiversity outcome, and potentially engaging around communities and stakeholders. This slide there is an aerial photograph of the Manapuri lake control. So just to explain it a little bit, there's an arc of concrete basically to the bottom portion of the picture. That's the lake control itself. It's a gate structure, and there are flows going through it from the north, which is the sort of straight piece of water, is the Mararoa Canal, the old Mararoa River, and coming in from the left is the Waio Arm, and it's coming down from Lake Manapuri. So water's flowing through those two courses, through the lake control and down the lower Waio River, past Tapiri and out to the sea, just to give it some context. This is our initial planting. So we started last year. We tried to get planting as quick as we can. The brown areas are areas that we are looking to plant with mixed forestry. The blue areas are low-lying wetland areas which we will have planted or started to plant with low-lying natives, so they don't accrue any credits for us, but they're just the right thing to be doing with those particular areas of land. We made a start on the area to the right, which is a sort of triangular area called Zone D. So the overall site is about 25 hectares. There'll be about 25 stems that go into that site. When it's at maturity, the carbon reduction of that will be about 1,000 credits, or 1,000 tonnes, 1,000 credits per annum, which roughly equates to the emissions from the Manapuri power station itself, which is quite a nice story about how we're offsetting locally. So what we've done over the last few months is plant this area here called D1, and there's an example of a wetland area that's wet within the site. And within this site are 4 species of eucalypts that have been planted, and unfortunately we had to cancel our native-only planting, which was scheduled for the end of March for obvious reasons in terms of having big events and lots of people in the one place. So we'll be looking to reschedule that later into the year. That's an example of the crew hard at work. These are people from the Manapuri station itself. We also had a science class from Fiordland College. So this is an example of the community engagement and the model that we're trying to prosper with Ekos. Science class joined the station crew, and we had a handful of other invitees to physically put the plants into the ground. That's an example of how the exotics are introduced into the site. We have these lines are called ripping lines. It's basically a blade that goes through the soil and creates a furrow, and the stems are planted along those rows with alternate rows of eucalypts and natives. And I think the important thing just to bear in mind with this site and with a lot of sites is that a lot of this is, no one quite knows how the natives will grow well. So we're doing test sites and test plots within these areas to just understand what grows best and where. But the basic philosophy underlying it is right tree, right place. And I should stress too, when we're talking about exotics, we're talking about the right exotic for the location. So what Meridian isn't doing is planting Pinus radiata, or we're not doing that. We're planting other forms of other species into those sites, things like eucalypts, tree lucernes and so on. which are appropriate for the local ecology. Our programs kind of last in the region of about 5 to 7 years. A key point from Meridian, being a large company and being a large landowner, our assumption when we started the program was that we would probably have enough of our own land to see the job through, but that's proved not to be the case. As we've done the work and the investigation, that we've had to restrict our land for operational reasons, ecological reasons, and so on. So we are now working with a range of third parties to utilise their land and work out a range of partnerships and joint ventures to see the program through over the next 5 to 7 years. It's a journey. There are things that we don't know and don't understand, but as well as planting, we're undertaking monitoring and science. So our knowledge base will build around the program, and that knowledge will be is not proprietary. It'll be shared with the carbon community, if I can put it like that, for the benefit of everyone. And at that point, Sean, I might hand back to you yourself.
Thank you very much, Mark. This is a photograph taken in the understory of a mixed native and eucalypt forest 40 years after it was established, just to show the mixed species model in action. And this project at Manapuri will be replicating this kind of planting. The goal here is to transition through time to native dominance over the course of about 100 years, maybe longer, across a 200-year management plan, where at the very end of that process, it's a native-only forest. So it's a patient version of a native forest establishment process. If we're impatient and want to plant natives only, we can do that so long as you triple your and more than triple your carbon price. So we're, as Ekos, more than happy to work with people who are willing to pay those higher prices. And if they're not, then the next best thing is to do a mixed species model.
So if you have more questions, please fire them through. We had one from Terry that was just a quick one. He didn't quite catch how many hectares you'll have to plant.
Yeah, I just answered that one, Barbara. Minimum 1,500 for our 37,000 tonnes. I should say too that we will end up in surplus. So part of Meridian's sustainability program is to scrub as much carbon and greenhouse gas out of our systems as we can. So we have a goal of a half by 2030. So at some point we'll end up in surplus, but you know, in the end, that's not going to be a bad place to be, we think.
Thank you. There's another one for you, Mark.
Yeah.
How does your statement that Meridian will always have to buy credits to offset emissions from thermal generation fit with the government's aim to reach 100% renewable by 2035?
Yeah, no, look, fair question, just to be clarified. So if we get to 100% by renewables by 2035, there will be no thermal generation in the system, for we won't be buying credits in that context. The other thing to bear in mind too is that there will be credits, emissions that derive from construction of new renewables too. So those will have to be offset in some way. And because that's, again, quite a variable amount and unknown, I think it's highly likely within this sort of horizon of 15 years that Meridian will be buying credits to offset its thermal contracting and any construction.
And one more, are you concerned about fire risks from changing climate and the three species chosen? For example, could gums be a risky choice for the drier areas of New Zealand?
That's a really great question. It's probably something I didn't speak to when I was speaking before. So there's two or three answers to this. The short answer is yes. Yes, we are concerned about that, and we do a lot of modelling and investigation of climate change. Anyway, as a hydro company, where we've got, as I said, we've got highly volatile inflows year to year, and climate change is is now and will be a big factor going forward in understanding that. Right tree for the right location. So yeah, I can understand the view about eucalypts. There's two or three things we're doing. So a minimum of 1,500 hectares planted. It'll be larger than that, and that will be self-insuring. So we're going to overplant to cater for any fire risk. The other thing that we're doing as part of our program is it's not, and I should have explained this, it's not one block of 1,500 hectares. We've got a series of projects that we're running from in Southland, the Waitaki, Canterbury, Christchurch, Wellington, and further north too. So all of them have their own conditions and characteristics, and I've likened it to running a fleet. It's a fleet of forests. So if one lot goes up in smoke or gets bowled over by a storm or knocked over by disease, then hopefully we're not too impacted by that. So there's a level of insurance there. And the other thing we're doing too is just looking, working with various people, just look at financial insurance, carbon insurance or financial insurance as well.
Thank you very much, Mark. We are slightly over time, so we'll have to wrap it up here. We have noted down all the other questions and we will get back to you, but we'll write them up also as frequently asked questions. We also will send through a very brief questionnaire to everyone just to get some feedback. What other topics are you interested in? Next webinars we have planned. We still have to set the exact dates around product stewardship. We have one in the pipeline on sustainable packaging approaches, and one on environmental product declarations about the new standard. You can also catch up on previous events. We had one recently on future thinking, on foresighting tools that is available for download. So please do get in touch if you have further questions and catch up from previous webinars. And with that, a very big thank you again to Mark for sharing your story and for Sean to tell us all about insetting. And with that, I wish you all a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone.